Okay. Galu Matseva refers to the story at the end of our Parashah, where Yaakov and Lavan are parting ways and establish a kind of a covenant in their departing with these two stone structures. And let's look at it just for a moment in the Psukim. Direction. Okay, so Yaakov leaves, and Laban finds out that he's gone, comes chasing after him, overtakes him, and expresses his anger at departing without telling him. And they have some back and forth. Yaakov responds and has his long, angry soliloquy. Why are you so critical of me? I never took anything from you, and endured so much suffering in serving you. And then Laban responds, come, let us make a pact. So Yaakov sets up an aven, takes a stone and sets it up as a matzeva, and then tells his brethren, whoever those are, to gather stones, and they take the stones. So here we have Vayikach Yaakov aven vayirimeha matzeva, and here Vayikchu avanim vayasu gal. They take stones and make a mound. They eat there. Lavan names it Yegar Sahaduta, and Yaakov names it Gal Eid. This is the answer to his good trivia question about where Aramaic appears in the Torah. And Lavan says this mound is going to be a witness between you and me today. That's why it's called, says the narrator, Gal Eid, the mound which serves as a witness, and it was called Mitzpah, because he said, Yitzef Adonai ben Yuvenecha, may God watch between you and me when we are no longer in sight of each other. What's the substance of that watching? Lavan says, if you ill-treat my daughters or take other wives besides them, God's self will be witness between you and me. Re'ei Elohim eid ben Yuvenecha. And Lavan says, here's the mound and here's the pillar. The mound will be a witness, Eid Hagal Hazeh, Ve'edah HaMatzeva, and the monument will be a witness, or the pillar. I'm not going to cross past this mound, and you're not going to cross past this mound and this pillar, L'ra'ah, with hostile intent. May the God of Abraham and the God of Nahor judge between us. Yaakov takes an oath by God, described here as Pachad Aviv Yitzchak, the fear of his father Yitzchak, offers up a sacrifice, and they eat, and then Lavan the next morning kisses his sons and daughters and says goodbye and goes home. Yaakov goes on his way, and we end the parasha. Fascinating. I mean, the whole Yaakov-Lavan relationship is fascinating, but the conclusion of it with this pact is really fascinating. So Rabbanit Tikochinsky quotes from the end of that story and writes, the separation between Yaakov and Laban is accompanied with an unusual ritual, tekes mishuneh. She quotes from these psukim. Yaakov and Lavan establish a covenant and promise not to cross this boundary with intent to harm one another, right? This is sort of their dividing line, which they can cross with malintent. The two witnesses that they choose to solidify through their aid this covenant are a pile of stones and a pillar, a single monument stone. The choice of two witnesses, domimim lachalutin, completely inanimate, who have no capacity to come and actually kind of verify the partners in the covenant, of their obligations is a surprising choice. Right? This is the kind of thing that, I don't know, I read the story so many times and never really thought about. Just sort of get used to the narrative and therefore take it for granted. Yep, here comes the covenant, here come the stones, and that's that. And she asks a question, which is if the purpose of the witnesses is to establish some kind of actual accountability, stones can't do that. Okay, we might just say that's an overreading, and witness doesn't mean someone who can actually hold you accountable. It just means somehow a marker. But if we want to take the maximum sense of what witnesses to a covenant are supposed to do, then the choice of stones is surprising. Indeed, the possibility of, or the choice to establish a covenant and set up witnesses who don't have the capacity to answer, she'ein lehem ma'aneh lashon, is something we recognize from other places. Yitzchak establishes a covenant in the matter of the wells. That was in last week's Parashah, and says these 7 sheep take from me in order that they be a witness that I have dug this well, right, and that it belongs to me, right? So we have sheep serving. Bracha writes, stones last longer than people, right? So if we're looking for eternal witnesses, then stones serve well, but they have the deficiency of not being able to call to accountability after this generation. But you pointed out well, the argument of the benefit of stones reads well with the fact that this is a kind of meant to be a more of an eternal covenant, more of a multi-generational thing, and so maybe the stones do have that advantage. And so already we see the point that this is not the only time where inanimate objects are chosen, or not inanimate, but non-human witnesses are chosen. Yitzchak uses sheep. Even before that, God has designated the rainbow as a symbol for the covenant between God and humanity. Again, we could simply say, well, what alternative did God really have? Same deal. God, there is no everlasting human. So maybe at some point the question has some limit. But there's also clearly some benefit to having an accountable, a party that can hold accountability. We find an additional story, and as we've seen already, I'll just tell you a side note, as we've seen already in a number of instances, because she sees rightfully Breshit as kind of the establishment of all kinds of symbols, concepts, rituals. So where these things start to appear, we want to query them. And even if we won't necessarily come out with such a specific reading for our parasha, we come out with a heightened awareness of these symbols and their deeper meaning and their uses. So delving into this, the question is a good question, whether or not we agree with the answer about what would be the right or wrong kind of witness to a covenant. An additional story of 2 witnesses that are non-human we find in the Gemara. Gemara and Tanit tells the story. Rabbi Ami says, come and see how great are kind of people of faith. From where? How do we know anything about this? From a weasel and a pit. Just as the one who trusts in the weasel and the pit, is somehow trustworthy. The one who believes in God, how much the more so? Okay, totally opaque to us or to me. And she continues. The story about trust in a weasel and a pit is brought in the Gemara, with just the slightest hint and in kind of as an enigma, cryptically, and requires explanation. Rashi fills in what's missing and explains that the whole story is found in the Agadah, an Aggadic legend, and that this is the story. So this is from Rashi. We have this also, a similar type of thing when the Gemara references Maaseh de Bruria, story of Bruria. What's the story of Bruria? It's not one that's recounted in the Gemara anywhere, and Rashi wholesale introduces an entire story. So these reminds us that There was plenty of oral tradition accompanying the Gemara, which just had to be filled in and passed down from generation to generation of interpretation. So here's the story of a young man who gave his faith, gave his promise to a young woman that he would marry her. And she said, who will testify to this? And there was a pit and a weasel there. So the young man says, the pit and the weasel will testify, right? They're right here. They are bearing witness to the fact that I promise I'm going to marry you. Some days passed. With the passage of some time, he transgressed his pledge and married someone else, gave birth to 2 sons. One fell into a pit and died, and one was bit by a weasel and died. And his wife said to him, what is this incident? That's a insufficient word, but what is this whole thing about, that our sons have died, these unusual deaths? And he said to her, such and such was the story. So her perplexedness at this strange and horrible events, prompt him to tell her about his broken faith to a different woman that he had never told her about. Again, lots we could ask about the story. Why should the children suffer from the father's infidelity or broken promise? A well-placed question, but not the preoccupation at the first order of the story. So the story about the pit and the weasel is a story of 2 witnesses from the inanimate and animal world that over a period of time accepted responsibility for their witnesshood and fulfilled their mission. They punished the breaking of the promise of marriage that this young man made to this young woman, and ultimately that punishment ultimately came to pass through their agency or through their hands, so to speak. Just as is written in the Torah, in Dvarim, Yad Ha'idim Tihiyeh Bo Barishona, right? When a person is punished by stoning, and the whole community carries out the stoning, but the first to participate in the execution of the punishment are the ones who bore witness to the wrongdoing. So we have this overlap between the witnesses as kind of the lead agents of carrying out the consequences for breaching the promise. In Parashat Ha'azinu, God brings to witness upon us, the Jewish people, heaven and earth. Right? That's, of course, when we think about major witnesses and eternal witnesses, that's probably the first that comes to mind. Give ear, O heavens, and I will speak, and hear, O earth, the words of my mouth. And in this instance, too, the witnesses are actually active in the punishment, right? As the Midrash says, why Ha'azinu Hashamayim and Tishma Haaretz? When the Jewish people don't fulfill the will of God, what does it say about them? And God's anger will flare against them, and God will stop up the heavens, right? As we say in 2nd paragraph of Shema, there'll be no rains, and you will be destroyed speedily from upon the earth, right? So the punishments are actually carried out by the witnesses. In contrast to people, this comes back to Bracha's point, in contrast to people who forget, ignore, aren't necessarily reliable to stand up to the test, erase or distance themselves, or maybe mochim actually is protest, or distance themselves. The witnesses that are not human, the kind of durable forces of nature, stones, pits, animals, obviously to varying degrees of durability here, symbolize a kind of an absolute fealty and loyalty to God, one which is unchanging. just like heaven and earth are also witnesses and also bearers of punishment, so too, according to the Midrash, the pile of stones and the pillar in our parasha also ultimately become agents of punishment. Now we're going to see, this is sort of not quite Dr. Aviva Zornberg, but is sort of evocative of Dr. Aviva Zornberg in terms of, the capacity to kind of take this text and move it forward by exposing us to midrashim we might not otherwise see. So what does it mean? This pile of stones will be a witness. So that's what the Torah later says in Parashat Balak, when it says Bilam's leg was pressed against the wall. You recall in the story of Bilam when he's on his way with his donkey to meet Balak and ultimately attempt to follow Balak's instructions or not, to curse Bnei Israel. The angel that he can't see appears in the way, and there are these multiple instances of increasingly constricted space that the donkey is unwilling to move forward. So in this moment, the donkey is pressing against the wall to try to, get around the angel of God that's blocking its path, that Bilam can't see, and it presses Bilam's leg against the wall as it tries to squeeze by. So the Midrash quotes that pasuk and says, this mound of stones is that wall, because Bilam transgressed the oath that was sworn to Yaakov, which is, lest you, or that you shall not cross this mound of stones or this pillar to do evil. Ubilam ze Lavan. That's we can cogitate on that. Bilam is Lavan. Obviously not precisely the same region, but in terms of, midrashic understandings of kind of paradigmatic potential opponents of the Jewish people. And Bilam they both are, but especially Bilam is a more complex character in Midrash, but in some way is being attempted to be co-opted to be an archenemy of the Jewish people. So he's a kind of carrying on Lavan's mission, and trying to move forward to do harm to the Jewish people, and getting, I guess, too close to the Israelite camp, across that sort of point, actual geographic or metaphorical geographic point of coming too close to the Jewish people to do them harm. And so he's, he gets hurt as a result. The leg of Bilam is pressed to the wall in order to remind him the oath that his great ancestor swore to Yaakov not to harm Yaakov, not to impact Yaakov for evil. And with the passage of many additional generations, Yoav, a much later descendant, will fight against Aram Naharaim, much more of Lavan's actual area, in the agency of David HaMelech. And then the people of the place will come out to meet him and demand that he uphold the oath made to Lavan and back down from engaging in, struggle or attack against them. This is a midrash which says, they said to him, you are from the descendants, the progeny of Yaakov, and we are the, great grandchildren of Lavan. And their conditional understanding remains. The conditions that they set remain. As it says, this mound is a witness. When Yoav heard this, he went back to David and he said, what do you say about the fact that there is the condition of this oath of Yaakov Avinu? He immediately established the Sanhedrin Shushan Edut. They taught and they said, this is in fact how it was, but they broke it first. Okay, so they take, on the one hand, seriously the notion of the oath, But then they look back into history and say, the agreement was abrogated already by Bilam, crossing the path, crossing the line. The sons of Yaakov, the descendants of Yaakov, according to this midrash, are now cleansed from the oath of Lavan from the time that Bilam broke it, and therefore they no longer have this obligation, of faith to the descendants of Lavan, and they can fight them. Just pause here because she's going to sort of shift modes a little bit, just to kind of reflect on the scope of this midrash and the interesting idea of kind of a covenant between a progenitor. I mean, on the one hand, close family members, and on the other hand, kind of the progenitor of the Jewish people and the proto enemy or one who seeks to do harm. Right? If we take Lavan as the character that's being described in Arameo Vedavi, an Aramean sought to destroy my father, then he's sort of the paradigmatic enemy of the Jewish people. And so the idea that on the one hand there stands this kind of covenant, and on the other hand, the idea that it, once it was broken, and the other side broke it. I mean, it certainly evokes all the kind of you broke the ceasefire first kinds of back and forths that happen and that are real, and that it matters who breaks it first, and yet the descent into war happens so quickly. Just I think as a meta midrash or a meta thought, the kind of question of this core covenant that, look, we don't agree with each other, but we'll make a cold peace, and then when is that abrogated, and is it then gone forever? I think is a really interesting deep midrashic reading into this moment in our parashah. So I'll pause for any thoughts or reactions to that before we take a look at the second half. Steve, go ahead and unmute.
This may not be a precise interpretation or similarity, but I'm thinking about the events of October 7th. The barrier wall was, to me, stones, a pillar beyond which the Palestinians could only enter with permission. And now that's probably going to be changed, that they will not be able to enter at all. And the barrier stones were, to me, a witness as to this, I don't know whether you could call it a covenant, but some distinction between the Palestinian people and the Israelis, and the fact that, like Bilam, they could not come too close to the Israelis to do harm. They managed to do that ultimately, and there's just a thought that I had. Forgive me for the analysis.
No, I think it's it begs it, and in some sense, what I also hear you saying is just sort of this is, I mean, if we think about kind of the development of nations and the question of what is the function of political geographic boundaries, what is the goal, what is their goal, it's kind of interesting the qualifier of lira'ah, right? That the notion that boundaries could be porous for good, but they have to be firm for evil. You can't cross this if you're going to do me harm, but if you're going to, if we're going to get together for good, so like it's open. I think it's just a really thought-provoking, and also the idea that kind of each sets up their own boundary, right? It was they didn't even agree upon, I don't know how much to make of this. They didn't even agree upon, well, let's collaborate and build the wall that will divide us. But it's sort of, here's my version of the dividing line, and here's your version of the dividing line. Is it to create a no man's land in between? Is it because each wants to, each needs to have its dimension of the witness of its participation. I don't know, but I think, yeah, but absolutely the sort of sense of, and in this midrash, makes room for the obvious, okay, once it was abrogated, now, we cross over into the other side. And again, here's where it gets even more dicey, because they're just security and military calculations that have to be had. But sort of the question of what's the consequence of one side, is it, is there room to say, okay, we have to hold you accountable for it, but we don't have to cross into your side? How do those things get thought about? So I think it's really interesting. David L., you're unmuted, please.
So since you've opened the door to talk about the psukim and not necessarily Dr. Tukachinsky's analysis of it, I think that it's very interesting that not only do they build separate barriers or separate erections of demarcation, that it's also the place where Lavan's influence over his family ends, and to where the girls are now passing over to the other side.
Mm-hmm.
And it's also hard to look at this without thinking about whether there are anatomical references in the matzeva on the one hand and the gal on the other hand, that stones perhaps evoke the idea that women are born with a full complement of eggs. The matzeva, you don't have to be very much of a Freudian to do whatever you want with that. And I don't know where else to go with any of that, but it does seem to call out in that direction.
Yeah, really, really interesting. Really interesting. She'll say a little something at the end about the symbolism of the two, not in that direction, but I think that's a really interesting one. Yeah, and of course, recognizing, I think as you noted here so clearly, these are not two unrelated peoples who are now establishing a boundary line and leaving each other alone, but there is the crossing over of the children of one to join the other, and so there's arguably a need for continued crossing back and forth, and for figuring out how to do that in a way that's safe and comfortable for everybody, because they're really not separate. They're really not separate peoples in that sense. Yeah, and the symbolism of each, I think, as you are described it, is really interesting. Thank you. Yeah, Bracha, please.
Does matzeva relate to matzav, like depending on the circumstances?
Not, I think, in the plain sense of the shoresh as I understand it. Although the truth is, I shouldn't say that. The shoresh of matzeva is nun sadi bet, which is standing firm, a sort of firmly standing thing. But I don't know what matzav. My guess is that the mem is. Actually, I don't even know. Yeah, matzav. Matzav is sort of like matzav is probably like where things stand. What's the matzav? Right. How are things set up right now? Yeah, they are related, I think. It's interesting. Yes, and I mean, matzeva has a sense of firmness. The matzav can be less yatziv, right? A matzav can be, as we have it in modern Hebrew, isn't necessarily stable in the way that a matzeva is. Yeah, interesting. I want to think more about that linguistic relationship. Isaac, please.
Am I on? Yeah.
Yeah, we hear you. Thank you.
Okay. So I was always intrigued about at the Seder and at other times. What about love? I didn't understand what his evil was about, or what made him perceived as such an enemy of the Jewish people. And of course, it's interesting that his family. He's the one that we go to for Rivka and for Rachel and Leah. To marry into. So quintessentially, what is the essence of his? I don't know how to describe it, because he doesn't strike me as the kind of evil that I might see with Esav, or somebody who's so genocidal, let's say.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, it's a good question. I think the rabbis seem to read him this way, and I'm sure there are midrashim and other things that I'm not thinking about in this moment, but I think it is a kind of reading of the way he economically and from a human dignity perspective just took advantage and deceived Yaakov over and over. I'm trying to remember on the Arameo Vedavi, like an Aramean sought to destroy my father. What is the meaning of the attempted destruction? So I have to go back and think more about that. I can't think off the top of my head of midrashim that argued that Lavan posed physical threat to Yaakov as much as, again, just trying to rob him of family, livelihood, etc., with things which are considered as tantamount to the value of life. But the sort of posing a direct physical threat, it's less clear off the top of my head what would have been meant by that. So it's a good question. Yeah, great. Dad, please.
No, I remember hearing or reading once that Lavan is white. So Lavan does not give the appearance of being evil. And that's where he is evil, because you're tricked by him. He's playing his like camouflaged as somebody good when he's really not.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm sure Shmuel Klitzner has more on that in his book Wrestling Jacob. I'm sure he picks up on that Lavan and more. So that's a good place for me to go look and see about a little bit more. So let's file this significant question about kind of Lavan's character and role, and how does he become this kind of paradigmatic evil wisher, and so deeply tied up in the family tree as well. Great. This is the most conversation that Rabbanit Dr. Tukachinsky has evoked so far. So that's great. And let's make our way on to the second half as soon as I pull that back open. Okay. All right. So we've sort of covered now the midrashic history. And now she's going to go into a more symbolic analysis. From the covenant of heaven and earth, we learn that there is significance and meaning to the specific identity of the witnesses. So, for example, from these, symbolic, symbolic identities of the weasel and the pit, for the male and female. Actually, I forgot about this line. To David's point, seeing them that way as well, and they hint as such to the covenant of couplehood. I guess again there too, the weasel being the masculine and the pit being the feminine, and so there's sort of the symbol of the commitment between the man and the woman, and they symbolize this expected partnership. What is the meaning of the identity of these witnesses, the pile and the single stone, in our parashah? The author of the Tzror Hamor, 15th century Sfarad, Morocco, suggests that the pile of stones and the pillar or monument are similar. Both of them are hewn from stone. The difference between them is that the mound is low and the pillar is high, meaning the covenant has a revealed layer and a lower hidden layer. The agreement to the kind of what's the right word for this? Putting down their weapons and kind of their hidden claims or animosity towards one another. It has a kind of immediate revealed layer. Ceasefire. It has an immediate and revealed layer, and it has a higher layer, which is, can be seen off to the great distances. That the children of Yaakov will need to always kind of examine the dynamics of this challenging relationship, right? So this is sort of the outward appearance of kind of peace and reconciliation, but also the underlying layer of remaining tension or hostility. So that's the sort of the sense of the respective objects being, lower and higher, giving indication to the revealed and the concealed. Upon his words, we can add more. The relationship, the dynamics between Lavan and Yaakov, which begin with the kind of bonds of family and work, are a complex and kind of pressuring system. Yaakov is enveloped and almost enclosed in this bear hug of his father-in-law for the kind of whole duration of the journey. The cultural gaps, the ethical and religious differences between these two men is apparent from the beginning of their journey until this kind of final crisis of separation, in which Yaakov finally emerges from the enclosure, that's not the best word, but of Lavan. The mound of stones and the pillar symbolize Yaakov and Lavan, or symbolize to Yaakov and Lavan, that they have to separate each one to their own direction and place this divider or barrier between them. Bilam breaks the trust when he takes upon himself the tools of the trade or the behaviors of Yaakov, which is speech and prophecy. And this is a well-trodden path of the Chachamim, sort of talking about this idea of Bilam kind of fighting Bnei Yisrael with their typical tools, the word, and then they wind up ultimately killing him with the sword, which is, Esav, or the sort of other mode of engagement in the world. Right, so Yaakov's descendants then cancel the covenant when they take upon themselves Lavan's trade, which is kind of attempt to conquer, overtake, appropriate the property of others. The question which stands at this juncture is whether and how much the coming generations will be able to continue to discern these differences, and how much they will be able to succeed in establishing a clear boundary line between the matzeva, the pillar, which was built for God's name, which protects Yaakov on his journey, and the mound of stones, which is kind of temporary, of Lavan. And that's, again, a little reading of kind of just descriptively the image or symbolism of each one. The matzeva as kind of firm, durable, and a religious object, and the mound of stones being read here as kind of hasty, not necessarily deceptive, but temporary in some way. Which ends. I heard from Rav Yehuda Brandis of Beit Morashah, and very much a teacher of Agadah and the relationship between Halacha and Agadah, one of his works, that we could also explain it in the opposite way. The Matzeva represents Lavan, whereas the pile of stones represents Yaakov. The Matzeva is a single stone, and the mound of stones is a collection. The Matzeva, the thing which was favored in the days of the Avot, right? That was, so consistent between Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. They were always building Matzevot. That was desired in the days of the Avot is now prohibited, as opposed to the Mizbeach, the altar, which is actually made as a collection of stones, Yachad Shiftei Yisrael, symbolic of the kind of unification or coming together of the diversity of the tribes of Israel, and that is permitted. A matzeva is, static and haughty in its stance, whereas the gal, the mound of stones, is dynamic, kind of complex, multifaceted, and also modest in its appearance or presentation. So I don't here too, not a single conclusion, and fascinating to imagine, the kind of flipping of the symbols. But if we go back to the psukim for a moment, done. We remind ourselves, let me just share screen one more time, that Yaakov does seem to do both, right? He takes a stone and sets it up, and then he tells his kinsmen. Now it's hard to know who were those kinsmen. Are these people from Yaakov's camp? Are they kinsmen from Lavan's family? It's just not totally clear. But both of them happen at Yaakov's instruction when we look at it more closely, and then they both name the mound of stones. Lavan kind of focuses on the gal, and kind of lays out the conditions, and is the one who says Hinei hagal hazeh, but also says Hinei hamatzeva. So the association of either one with either of them is not clear in the text, and so it does really leave it open to potential cross application in that sense. But I'll take a last round of reactions or comments, but hopefully we had a chance to see here kind of the opening question, which is what's the function, something to alert ourselves to as we read through the whole Tanakh. What's the where do we see edim to covenants? What are the relative advantages or significances of there being inanimate objects, animals, people? When are witnesses also expected to be kind of the consequence bearers, or when do they just kind of report on the status of the covenant and other people are responsible for then carrying out consequences? Just a sort of a fascinating open question about edim across the Tanakh and edut across the Tanakh, and then coming to the midrashic symbolism of this one as the kind of almost paradigmatic peace treaty between Israel and other nations, recognizing that this other nation is deeply bound up as family also, and then the sort of consequences, reading it forth into subsequent generations. Who breaks it? What happens when it's broken? What does that mean about either side's responsibility? Now, is it sort of gone forever in that midrash? Can it be resurrected? And then the second half coming to the symbolism of the mound versus the pillar, and different possible interpretations of that. Last thoughts, reactions, feel free. Okay, great. The other one, which we won't get a chance to see, was her take on Kvitzat Haderech, on the idea that appears just a few times in rabbinic literature, about a journey which is hastened by somehow the earth contracting to allow the journeyer to get from their point of departure to their destination more quickly. And she looks at the three instances, analyzes different meanings of why, what the purpose of a hasty journey is. And then in the second half, points out actually how rare it is, and that's indicative of the fact that, the Chachamim much prefer journeys to take as long as they're supposed to take. And the idea of a hastened journey is sort of counter to the general thrust of tradition, which is like, you have to go on the journey and you have to experience everything that happens along the way. And it's the hastening is only the exception that proves the rule, that the journey is as important as the destination. But there's symbolism and significance to the couple of the three exceptions in the Midrashim about Kvitzat HaDerech. So if you want to take a look at that, that's also in the email. Thanks to everybody, and wishing a good Thanksgiving weekend. I'll be with my family in Baltimore, so looking forward to seeing Mom and Dad, not just on the screen, and back together next Monday. Take care, everybody. Shkoch and good night.